Hello chess buddies, welcome to Amateur Chess University. Congratulations to Magnus Carlsen, who has now won the Tata Shield Masters 2022 event with a round to spare. He leads the standings with 8.5 points and he will earn a forfeit win in round 14 against Daniel Dubois, who will not be able to get back into the tournament despite a negative PCR test. Today, we'll be looking into the round 13 game played between Magnus Carlsen and his long-term rival Fabiano Caruana in the Tata Shield Masters 2022 event. So without further ado, let's head straight into the game. Fabiano here had the white pieces and he begins with e4, going for the king's pawn opening. Magnus replies with c5, the Sicilian defense, knight to f3 by white, and knight to c6 by black, going for the old Sicilian variation. Here white plays light square bishop to b5, going for the Rosellino attack, and black pushes the g7 pawn to g6, going for the fianchetto variation of the Rosellino attack. The idea for black here is the dark square bishop to g7 next. White castles in this position, and black brings the dark square bishop to g7. Here white plays c3 and black develops the king's head knight, bringing it to f6, targeting the e4 pawn. And here white plays rook to e1. Black castles in this position and white pushes the d2 pawn to d4. The idea here is to play d5 next, and black prevents this by playing pawn to d5. Now white didn't capture the pawn on e5, instead it played the e4 pawn to e5, targeting this knight. And here Magnus played his knight to e4. Now Fabiano played his dark square bishop to e3, and black captured the pawn on d4. c3 pawn captured the pawn on d4, and here Magnus played his queen to b6, targeting the bishop at b5. Here white moved the queen to e2, supporting the light square bishop, and black brought the light square bishop to d7, preparing to move the knight at c6 and target the light square bishop at b5 twice. Here Fabiano moved his light square bishop back to a4, and here Magnus moved his rook at a8 to c8. Now Fabiano developed his knight at b1 to c3, and knight captured the knight on c3. b2 pawn captured the knight on c3, preparing to bring the rook to b1 and target the queen. So Magnus moved his queen back to d8. Here Fabiano brought his light square bishop to b3, targeting this pawn at d5, and Magnus played his knight at c6 to a5, attacking the bishop. Now with the knight moving away, the rook at c8 is targeting the pawn at c3. Now there are few games in the database in the same position where white played dark square bishop to d2, the rook at e1 to c1. However, Fabiano here moved his rook at a1 to c1 to support the c3 pawn. And it is as of move 16 that we have a completely new game. Here knight captures the light square bishop on b3, and a2 pawn captures the knight on b3. And Magnus played his queen to b6, targeting the b3 pawn. And here Fabiano moved his queen to a2. Now Magnus pushed his a7 pawn to a5. And Fabiano played his queen to a3, targeting the e7 pawn. And Magnus moved his rook at f8 to e8. Pawn to c4 by white. And d5 pawn captures the pawn on c4. And b3 pawn captures the pawn on c4. And queen to a6 by black, targeting the c4 pawn twice. And Fabiano pushed his c4 pawn to c5, creating a triangular pawn chain. While b7 to b6 pawn next could be considered an option to break this pawn chain, Magnus decided to play his light square bishop to c6, preventing pawn to d5. And here Fabiano played his rook from c1 to b1, and Magnus pushed his a5 pawn to a4. Here Fabiano played his rook at e1 to c1, and Magnus moved his rook at c8 to d8, targeting the d file. The best idea for Fabiano in this position would have been to play his rook from b1 to b6 and then target this queen. However, he decided to move his knight to d2. Perhaps his idea is now to play rook to b6 or bring the knight to d4. However, this was a little too late because now Magnus played his non-active queen at a6 and he brings it to e2. His idea is to play queen to g4 next and then target this g2 pawn twice. Fabiano decided to play his pawn from f2 to f3. But this move provided Magnus with a brilliant idea. So feel free to pause the video and try to find out the move played by Magnus next. If you're able to figure it out, well done. The move played by Magnus Carlsen in this position was capturing the pawn at d4 with his rook. This was a fantastic move in this position because now Fabiano was forced to capture the rook at d4 with his dark square bishop. And since the dark square bishop has left the e3 square, Magnus was able to capture the knight at d2 with his queen. Now it's Magnus who has the full tempo. So let's see how the game proceeded from here on. Fabiano now moved his rook from c1 to d1, targeting the queen at d2 and Magnus moved his queen to f4. Now the e5 pawn is under double attack from the dark square bishop as well as the queen. The better idea for Fabiano in this position would have been to move his queen from a3 to c3. However, he decided to play his queen to b4. His idea is to play his e5 pawn to e6 next. However, Magnus prevented this by playing his e7 pawn to e6. Again, the best idea for Fabiano in this position would have been to move his queen from b4 to a5. However, he decided to play his dark square bishop to c3, offering a queen exchange. Now queen captures the queen on b4, and here Fabiano made another mistake. He should have captured the black queen with his rook at b1. However, he decided to capture the queen with his dark square bishop, but this leaves the e5 pawn hanging, and Magnus captured the e5 pawn with his dark square bishop. If you look at this position, Fabiano has two rooks and a dark square bishop against Magnus, who has the rook and both the colored bishops. However, it is Carlsen who has the pawn advantage, and both his bishops are in the center, controlling the diagonal in parallel. And Fabiano's rook are stifled with very little space to move. So Fabiano here decided to eliminate one of the bishop threads. He played his dark square bishop to a3, preparing to bring it to b2 next. Here, Carlsen moved his dark square bishop to f6. His idea is to play his dark square bishop to h4 next, and then control this diagonal, especially the f2 square. Fabiano recognized this. He played his king to f2, and here Magnus moved his dark square bishop to e7. Here Fabiano played his rook from b1 to b6, targeting the light square bishop at c6, and Magnus moved his rook from e8 to c8. Here Fabiano moved his rook from d1 to d2, and Magnus pushed his f7 pawn to f6. Again, the best idea for white in this position would have been to move the king to e3. However, Fabiano again made a mistake here. He pushed his f3 pawn to f4. Now Magnus played his e6 pawn to e5. f4 pawn captures a pawn on e5, and f6 pawn captures a pawn on e5, exposing white king to the full open line. Here, Fabiano moved his rook from d2 to e2, targeting this isolated pawn at e5, and Magnus played his rook from c8 to f8, delivering a check. Here, Fabiano moved his king to e1, and Magnus brought his rook to f5, threatening the e5 pawn. Now the best option for white here was to play the rook to b4, preventing pawn to e4 next. However, Fabiano decided to move his rook to b1. Now Carlsen pushed his pawn from e5 to e4, and Fabiano moved his rook from b1 to c1. Here Carlsen played his dark square bishop to h4, delivering a check, and Fabiano pushed his g2 pawn to g3. Now Carlsen brought his dark square bishop back to g5, taking the rook at c1, and Fabiano moved his rook to b1. Here Carlsen played his rook to f3, targeting the dark square bishop at a3, and Fabiano moved his dark square bishop to c1, asking for the bishop exchange. Carlsen didn't allow this. He played his dark square bishop to f6. Here Fabiano played his rook at b1 to b6, looking to eliminate the light square bishop. Here Carlsen played his rook from f3 to f5, targeting the pawn at c5, and Fabiano moved his dark square bishop to a3, supporting the pawn at c5. Now Magnus moved his king to f7, and Fabiano moved his rook at e2 to f2, preparing for the rook exchange. Magnus didn't capture the rook at f2, however, he moved his rook from f5 to f3, which was another smart strategy because now he can play his pawn from e4 to e3 because the rook will be defended by the light square bishop. So Fabiano had no other choice but to capture the rook at f3, and pawn captures the rook at f3. Here Fabiano moved his king to f1, and Carlsen brought his dark square bishop to d4, and it was in this position after move 49 that Fabiano resigned the game. Carlsen has built a strong wall with his pawn and light square bishop pair, and with the king coming into the picture as well as both the bishops targeting the long diagonals, along with two pass pawn at f3 and a4, the writing was on the wall for white. So Fabiano had no other option but to resign. So that's the game. Fabiano couldn't bring out his best solid performance, and he committed a lot of uncharacteristic errors. And it was Magnus once again coming out on top, playing with the black pieces this time, continuing his superiority to win the Tata Steel Masters event with a round to spare. If you have any thoughts on the game, feel free to share below. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.